I'm John Travis in Novato, California on the 8th of April, talking to David Smith in San Francisco, and the year is 2020. So delighted to see you after almost 50 years.
Right.
You sponsored me when I was just starting at the Wellness Center. I don't even think it was open yet, at your storefront in the Haight back in
Right.
75. So no, not 50 years, 45 years. Yes, do my math here. So we're going to find out more about who you are and why, what's led you to your contributions to what I consider wellness, anything that increases the freedom of people to be themselves and to have access to medical care and things that our culture has been reluctant to do in particular. So let's start with where you were born and siblings and what your childhood was like and how that might have influenced your work.
Well, it's interesting that we're having this dialogue because I'm in the process of writing my autobiography because my grandparents were farm workers from Oklahoma. I was born and raised in Bakersfield. I had Grapes of Wrath, Hokie background. And if in the 6th grade, you would have said, you looked out at the class and said, who would be in the Haight-Ashbury running a free clinic on the front lines of the COVID virus epidemic, and they passed out numbers, I would be number 100. I was the least likely to end up doing this type of thing. So, exploring how somebody from my background that ended up doing what I'm doing has been very interesting. And I'm also writing this in part because the new generation of free clinic workers who are just heroic. Here where I'm at in Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco, I've lived in the same 5-block area for 60 years since I started UC Med Center. Just up the hill is UC Med Center, where I went to medical school. They've had several serious cases, and they're building tents out in front for the overflow. Mm-hmm. And just down the hill is the medical section of our Haight-Ashbury Clinic. And every day, these young frontline workers come and risk their lives to care for patients. So it's very inspiring to see the new generation of mission-driven healthcare workers. For me, my mother was a nurse. I evolved as a good student. I was a kind of a student athlete, but I also had an episodic alcohol problem, and I felt as an outsider. In other words, I tried to accomplish what I did in order to help heal inner feelings of insecurity. That becomes a very dominant theme. So I was a fortunate beneficiary of the golden age of education in California. My mother died in 1956, and my father died soon after that. So I basically grew up as an orphan. I didn't have any siblings. School was my family. I went to Bakersfield College, a community college. I was during the GI Bill, so there was excellent education at no cost. I went to UC Berkeley between 58 and 60, and I know that my dad, just prior to his dying in 1960, sent me $80 a month, which covered tuition, room, and board. Mm-hmm. So when you compare that to the unbelievably high cost of education now, it would be a miracle. But that's the way it was. It was California education for Californians. So I received an excellent education. When I went to medical school, a very good med school at UCSF, there was a pharmacology. and I became very interested in the study of psychopharmacology. So I got a master's degree in pharmacology with a special interest on psychoactive drugs, and was studying LSD, amphetamine, when you saw the first psychedelic revolution start to ramp up. It had Dr. Sidney Cohn, who wrote The Beyond Within, Alan Watts. I remember going to these lectures with Sidney Cohn, hearing about how LSD impacted on the brain. Alan Watts talking about the mystical experience of LSD, sitting on a mat at the Zen Center with people surrounding him. It was just a total new experience that I listened to it and studied, but really did not participate in a sense of, other than just being aware of the growing psychedelic culture. And then it started to explode into the world that I lived in. They had the Trips Festival where everybody took LSD, and it was Ken Kesey and can you pass the acid test, in which they would take LSD, and they would start appearing here in the Haight-Ashbury. And in my medical training fellowship after graduating from med school, I was the director of the Alcohol and Drug Abuse Screening Unit at San Francisco General Hospital. We started seeing these kids come in with bad trips, and they were escalating. And I still believed in the straight world establishment. So we went to the health department and said, there's going to be all of these people coming. They're drawn by the music. The Grateful Dead would play in the park. It was a fascinating time because it was a new type of music. Prior to that, music had a defined beginning and ending. The Grateful Dead played to literally thousands of people, all under the influence of psychedelic drugs, and there was no beginning or no end. It just went on and on and on and on and on and on and on. And then these young women would twirl, and they would have, mess up their feet because LSD has pain-reducing properties, but they wouldn't feel it during the time. And then we started seeing, bad trips, but the key pivotal events was the human being in January of 1967, because many of us still felt this was an isolated subculture phenomenon. And I remember coming and observing the human being, not being part of it, but observing it. And people were absolutely stunned that thousands of hippies dressed in, like, they had this view of the earth and naturalistic view of life, and they were all taking psychedelics and beating drums and taking psychedelics, and there was no fights, and it was peace and love. And Alan Watts chanted, and Timothy Leary spoke, turn on, tune in, drop out. The Grateful Dead played, and you started getting a feeling that something was happening. You just didn't know what it was. Mm-hmm. So when we went to the city, they said, we don't want to set up a special clinic. Our first proposal was called a Hippy Clinic. It's interesting because my papers from that era are archived up at the UCSF library, and they have this. It was a handwritten outline that eventually was published as a regionalized healthcare facility in the Haight-Ashbury. And that came from the war on poverty, that they had set up these community, these neighborhood clinics.
Right. Jack Geiger in the late 60s. So I was at the first one in Boston as a
Right.
medical student.
And this public health nurse that I was dating, Flo Martin, showed me about the Watts Clinic.
Mm-hmm.
So I got the idea that, well, you need that type of neighborhood clinic in Haight-Ashbury for this special population. You know, that it was a good idea.
Mm-hmm.
I went to the Haight-Ashbury, the health department, San Francisco Health Department, and they said, no way. If you set up healthcare, it'll just come. In fact, it's interesting in the historical notes, they had these signs that said, hippies go home, we don't want you, on the bridge. And it reminded me, then it started to click into my own background, where in the 30s, they had Okies go home, we don't want you. So my own background of feelings of discrimination were activated.
Mm-hmm.
And they had Terrence Hallinan was the son of Vincent Hallinan. It was an old a left-wing activist. He eventually became district attorney. He had organized Mississippi Freedom Riders here in the Haight on Cole Street. Remember this? I'm talking about all these things happening, but actually it's all within walking distance of where I live. When you write about it, and people that don't know this area as you do, you think this was all over the place. This was all within a relatively short time. It was the epicenter of the evolving counterculture. There was an explosion of ideas. I started realizing that I was learning more. I was learning as much on my way home from the university as I on the street in the culture as I was, you know, at the university. So this human being was quite a transformative experience.
What month was that in
January 1967.
67? So it was wintertime, but
Yeah, it was still, you know, sometimes San Francisco, it would be very sunny in the winter.
yeah.
It just happened to be a sunny day.
And it was in Golden Gate Park, or
Yeah, it was in Golden Gate Park, on what they now call Hippy Hill.
Mm-hmm.
So it was quite in the Polo Ground. So it was quite an amazing turnout. And so I made a decision that I would take LSD myself. Prior to that, I was a student and an expert, but I'd never taken it myself. So, you know, I took it, I went up to Lake Tahoe, I took it, and it was a transformative experience. I felt that I had broken through the doors of perception and experienced the other side. Lights changed color. You could see air. That's the phenomenon of synesthesia, in which one sensory modality changes the other. I feel like I experienced the cosmos. All things were connected. And that I also believed in became a believer in the afterlife, because when you experience the cosmos, you feel energy. You feel good energy and you feel bad energy. And I came away with the belief system that the cosmos is a battle between good energy and bad energy. That some religious systems call the good energy God, and they call the bad energy the devil. But really what it is not anthropomorphic, where I didn't actually see, you know, God or Jesus. I just felt it. I felt that when you die, you know, what happens is the sum of your life is how much good energy you put into the world. So I decided that this was the path I should be on, because remember, then I still had one foot in I actually had both feet in the straight system. And my goal was academic success and financial success And this was all just study. But I became a participant, and I did what people do, you know, when they have this transformative experience. I sold my car, I bought a green VW bus, I grew my hair long, I totally plunged into starting the free clinic. And the free came from the diggers, which were basically the social service agency or social service group of the counterculture with Peter Cody, and had started this idealistic alternative society in the Haight that had free food, free education. They wanted free healthcare, except they found out that they wanted like barefoot doctors, and doctors won't do that. You know, they won't just go on the street. You know, they want a setting, they want instruments, they want malpractice insurance. So even though the city fought us tooth and nail, they didn't want it. A friend of mine, Bob Conrich, who was actually an LSD dealer, that was the businessman of the counterculture then, that knew business, found that you could, if you found a properly zoned medical office, you could call it anything you wanted. You wouldn't have to apply to the city. So they found 558 Clayton Street. We leased it, and the beginning free clinic was David E. Smith, MD, and Associates doing business as the free clinic. In other words, we found a loophole in the system that allowed us to set up a clinic. And the first day in June 7th, 1967, with no advertisement, we saw 300 patients the first day. The word spread through. There was all sorts of medical problems. They would come out here thinking it was going to be sunny, and you know, San Francisco, you can have more sunny days in the winter than you can in the summer. And they got colds, they cut their feet. They had lots of infections. Some of our founding slogans were "Love needs care," because they came out here for free love and got gonorrhea. We ran a VD clinic for all these young people that were getting sexually transmitted disease. We found it was a very unusual environment in order to practice medicine. For example, one of the keys of venereal disease is testing and treating contacts. So in would come Johnny, who had a good acid trip and had changed his name to White Rabbit. So that was a problem. It just says, please be the same thing every day you come in. Because he had a bad trip and he went back to being Johnny from Cleveland, and we couldn't find his chart. So if you're going to be White Rabbit the first day, be White Rabbit the next day. So Johnny had come out here and he lived in a commune and he had gonorrhea. He had sex in the commune with Jane, Mary, and Sunflower. I says, where are Jane, Mary, and Sunflower? I don't know. They've gone to live in a commune in Northern California. So we try to track them. Mm-hmm. And then, you know, these are examples. Well, where's Mary? We find out, well, she's now Moonbeam. So, you know, names changed, places changed. And so we formed a commune health group to go out there to give them proper medical care. This was by Ruth Fleischman, who was a public health nurse. And then she found out that the medical conditions in these idealistic communes, which had moved out of the Haight, were really bad. In other words, they were having babies because they felt that it was, you know, a way of repopulating the earth with enlightened young people, but their prenatal care was bad, their postnatal care was bad, they had infections. This population tended to reject Western medicine. So you had to take appropriate medical practices and adapt it to their culture so that they would accept it. And they used a lot of marijuana, so you couldn't put marijuana down. That would be like putting their sacrament down.
Yeah.
You had to adjust your practice to deal with the health consequences. So that was the transformative experience in the early days of the free clinic. And that was when I went over to the other side. I always remained 1 foot in the straight world, because that's where I recruited the physicians. I would give lectures, the medical students would come out. There was newspaper articles by David Perlman, Medical Mission in the Haight. That's how Bill Graham found out about it. The musicians did benefits for us. So our clinic was truly built on rock and roll during that turbulent period of the 60s, when I went from psychedelics into speed into heroin. Things got really bad. And then the next phase was the Vietnam veteran phase, where the vets kept coming back, strung out on heroin. They were very alienated from the VA. They were treated like garbage by society. But our free clinic had non-judgmental health care. We just took care of them. And so then we started receiving our federal grants, because they started funding the places where the vets went. So it evolved from the early days to the middle phase, which is the middle phase was more government-funded grants dealing with the heroin, cocaine, and meth epidemics.
And what was your staffing like? Was it just you at that point, or how many docs?
Oh, no. We had me, we had a lot of volunteer physicians, young physicians. We had students that had read about it, really top people. Dr. Fred Schick, who became a top psychiatrist locally. We had Dr. Ernie Dernberg, who was a top psychiatrist. They were sympathetic to the population. Mm-hmm. And then we had older physicians that, and I say older, I'm 81 now, so 30 and 40 was older to me then, who had kids. Let's say they were 40 and 50, and they had kids. They were worried about their kids, and they volunteered in the culture to better understand what their kids are going through. And then we had other types of physicians. One of the most prominent was Dr. David Breithaupt, who was internist on the faculty of UCSF. And he was it was the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement were boiling then. And he was very anti-war, and he viewed this as supporting what would be called the movement. The movement protested against the war, protested against civil rights violations, and supported alternative health care. So there was a flourishing movement then that could now be described as the progressive movement. That wasn't really what, it was just viewed as an alternative movement then, and lots of people participated in it for various reasons. I had my reasons for doing it. I was not political. I was kind of psychedelic transformative. Others were political. Others were worried about their kids. And the medical teams were very strange medical teams in the sense that we had to be medical and supervision. But for example, LSD was declared illegal. And so they started experimenting with alternative psychoactive compounds. These groups, it turned out, were called psychotomimetic amphetamines. And those are what MDMA and MDA and MDA are, but they were developed in a large group. The most powerful one was called DOM, and that lasted for 24 hours. And they called it Serenity, Tranquility, and Peace, or STP. So what would happen in these large events, these large events in the park were where they distributed these new drugs. So the Grateful Dead playing in Golden Gate Park, and I think it was June after we opened the clinic. And they passed out 5,000 free samples of STP. STP turned out to be a very powerful drug, and its power was because it lasted so long. It was a combination of a psychedelic and an amphetamine. It had very potent stimulatory effects. And so the psychedelic experience would transition into a delirium, and the people would freak out, and they came pouring into our clinic. And we had a comm center there where we talked them down. And one of the lead people was called Swami, or Super Guru. And he had a candle, and he would have them in a circle, and they would chant, and they'd focus on peace and love, and he would talk them down. So they didn't have to go to the emergency room, which freaked them out because there was police and ambulance drivers. So we demonstrated that even with the worst cases, we could talk them down. Now, where I would get called in, if one really got out of it, I would give them medication. Turns out we gave them depressants, hypnotics, because the first one is amphetamine psychosis you treat with an antipsychotic drug like Thorazine. We found that Thorazine actually made it worse for some complicated pharmacological reasons. So then we started this poster campaign. Don't take STP, call the clinic, Thorazine makes it worse, because on the street, the people that took LSD all carried Thorazine with them. Not because it made you high, they did it to self-medicate a bad trip. It'd be kind of like how heroin addicts now carry Narcan with them. And the self-administration of this became counterproductive. So it was an early example of street education using the medium of that culture. They've now talked about how in the 60s, poster art and music were the internet of the 60s. So if you wanted to reach the drug culture, you would have posters, music, and outreach workers like Swami or Super Guru go out and present, because they were trusted. And then it was a psychedelic art. They've just had exhibits of this, like with Stanley Mouse and others. And this poster art has become very popular throughout the United States. And somebody has seen it and they said, how could you possibly read that thing? And he would say, well, you got to be under influence of LSD to read it. So it's kind of like code. It was a fascinating time.
Interesting. Well, I was in the middle of med school in Boston, and only later I knew something was going on. I came out here for my internship over at the Public Health Service Hospital in '69 as things were started on the downhill.
Right.
The Summers of Love. But later I read Ringo Livio, forgotten the guy's name, that was one of the diggers.
Emmett Grogan.
Yeah, Emmett Grogan, yeah.
Yeah, he was Peter Coyote, Emmett Grogan, and Art Lish were key people in the diggers. And it was interesting that Peter Coyote was a visionary, and we seemed to get along well with him. Emmett Grogan felt we were too establishment. He's the one that wanted the doctors to go out on the street. And I got into some conflict with him because he came into the clinic with a deer carcass, and he wanted to put the deer carcass in our refrigerator where all the meds were. And I said, well, you can't do that. So, you're straight, you're establishment. So there was some tension. There was a tension with the straight world, and there was tension with the counterculture world. But what happened was when the Summer of Love started to die, they had death of Hippy, that they left and went on to their or why. It turned out Emmett Grogan died of an overdose in New York, and some of them died of alcoholism, and others like Peter Coyote, who's still a supporter of our clinic, went on to have a very successful acting career. And, I stayed in place, and our founding principles of our Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic, where healthcare is a right, not a privilege, love needs care. And I just was listening to Bernie Sanders on TV, and he said that we are trying to transform the thinking of the country, that healthcare is a right, not a privilege.
Yeah.
Now, it was those leading political leaders like Ted Kennedy and Bernie Sanders and Barack Obama that mainstreamed it. But the philosophy, the term, came out of the Summer of Love. I remember when I said that first, it was in an angry response to the health department. Bob Conrich and I were there, and they weren't, they were negative towards us for all the reasons I've already reviewed. And I said, in a typical heat of passion, healthcare is a right, not a privilege. That became the founding slogan of our clinic. So one of the reasons that the history is important is there are young people out there now with creative ideas that go against the mainstream. And they need to know to be the courage of their convictions and stay the course. And maybe the establishment will latch onto them, maybe they won't. I know the current administration is very anti-healthcare as a right, not a privilege. In fact, the president has said it.
Yeah.
But the coronavirus epidemic has shown that things like employer-based healthcare is a disaster in the times of an epidemic. All these people are out of work. They don't have health insurance. And it turns out that it is not just good medicine to take care of the individual, it's good for society. In other words, those that can't get treated get sicker. They spread the disease to the rest of the society. And of course, this fits into your wellness movement. The wellness of people and the culture is not just good for them, but it aids all of society.
Yeah.
I know I'm preaching to the choir there. You've been a leader in that, but we very much believe that.
Yeah. Well, tell me more about your encounters with the regulatory people and how you described your speaking out, your coming up with your slogan. Did that eventually settle down? Did they accept you once you had the clinic up and running, or how easy was that?
There was a phase in which it got worse. In other words, when the speed and heroin epidemic hit, we set up the first community-based outpatient detox program.
Mm.
The first was speed, the speed culture, and 409 Clayton Street, which was a very interesting system, because what happened then is, as you recall, everybody is moving out of the Haight. So these houses were basically almost abandoned. They or very low cost. They want to move out of the Haight. So you could get one of these old houses and set up a clinic in it, even though it was a violation of, I think, one of our facilities at 529, the detox, we had 39 code violations. But that's also when I found out that keeping one foot in the straight world was necessary for survival.
Yeah.
So, the planning department would come in and say, you know what Smith did at 529 Clayton Street? He moved into a residential zone only for residential. They tore out the bathroom, put in a pharmacy, put in a medical clinic, 100 addicts a day are coming in, and it's a violation of all of these codes. And Willie Brown, always our patron saint, said, get off Smith's back, they're doing a good thing. So that was where, San Francisco was undergoing a transformation politically. Been reading Season of the Witch, that San Francisco, basically its core was not Bohemian, it was very strict Irish Catholic. But there was a political transformation with Willie Brown, the Burtons, George Moscone, Harvey Milk. And so when you saw this political transformation, we supported that, but we needed to make sure they knew we were part of that movement. We couldn't be a kind of an isolated outsider. We had to be viewed as part of that transformative progressive movement in San Francisco, and we did. Haight Free Clinic now is part of the DNA in San Francisco. But it was transformative, there was bad stuff happening. I'm getting all sorts of awards now. So that shows you, if you live long enough and stick to your principles, things will come around. Don't expect applause early. Just stick to your principles. And as Martin Luther King says, the arc of the universe is long, but eventually tilts towards justice. So that's where those philosophical things have value. The second phase was a rough one. There was a police crackdown on addiction in Haight. And they started, because then addiction was a crime. It's not what it is now, understood as a brain disease, and treatment is available. There was not a treatment available then, other than programs like Synanon. But there was no outpatient community-based treatment. And that's what we did in a non-judgmental way, because we believe that addiction was a disease and the addict has a right to care, which was an extension of our overall philosophy. The DEA saw these addicts coming into 529 Clayton Street. They sent in undercover agents. They had DEA agents across the street on the roof taking pictures of us coming in. We were on a list. And if there was a crackdown, they intended to arrest us all. But then Matt O'Connor, the head of the DEA, who I had spoke with on a panel, said, look, they're doing a good thing. The undercover agent says, I don't know why they're doing it. They don't give them drugs. They try to get them off drugs. It's weird, but they're trying to do a good thing. So he came to me and he said, I believe you're doing a good thing. I know you. You're out of the university. Don't know why you're doing it, but you're doing a good thing, you and your staff. And but you need to put up, you need to do a better job of patrolling the waiting room. He says they're dealing drugs in the waiting room. Some of the people in the waiting room waiting to seek care have offered drugs to undercover agents, which is not a good thing to do. So we put up this sign, which is actually part of rock and roll art now. It's a psychedelic sign that says no holding, no dealing. Any of these things can close the clinic. And it's interesting, by appealing to that, recognizing that those interactions could close the clinic, then the clinic was very much viewed as part of the culture, the helping agent in the culture. It wasn't viewed by the patients as part of the establishment, and that it was a treasure, and they didn't want it messed with. And we've treated a number of addicts over the years. My wife, Millicent Buxton, who has been in recovery for heroin for now 43 years, set up the first 12-step Narcotics Anonymous meeting in that 529 Clayton Street.
Hmm.
And when you talk to these recovering addicts, they say the first thing I saw when I walked up those stairs to get detox was that door. In other words, when they walked in, the door was a message that was in their minds, and that drug dealing in the waiting room could close the clinic. And interestingly enough, it disappeared. It still happened on the street, but it didn't happen in the clinic.
Hmm.
So we were able to demonstrate that we had a way of dealing with it through education, appealing to the culture without arrest. Now, the arrests were going out on the street. You know, they had a police siege of the Haight-Ashbury in 1968, and they arrested people, and they actually invaded one of our facilities at 409 Clayton Street, and Father Lyle Grosjean's on the steps and saying, you can't do that, this is a house of peace. And I was out on the street because they were beating up a hippie, and they whacked me with a baton. So I'm not trying to say that things were peaceful, but they, within the framework of the clinic, that worked. And now, of course, it's changed. Our biggest allies on the street are the beat police. They're out there with the fire department resuscitating heroin overdoses. The drug problem in San Francisco now is much worse now than it was then. There are more IB drug users in San Francisco than there are high school students. There's needles all over the street. They're overdosing, and they like the fact that our medical people are there, as long as the police department and the fire department. So we're all in it together. There's not the antagonism there was in the past. So we believe we're on the different parts of the same mission.
Yeah.
And it's a very interesting city, as you know. I'm the oldest guy in the basketball league, and I still play basketball at the Olympic Club. And for a long time, I kept those two worlds very separate. I was afraid that if they knew that I was getting my life threatened by speed dealers in the Haight, they'd be afraid that they'd come after me and shoot up Olympic Club members. And so I kept those worlds very separate. I always felt that if they found out what I really did, they would kick me out. Well, now at the recent basketball game, I'm assistant captain, and I can make one basket a game. And the referee said he was a former police officer working on Haight Street, and we worked together resuscitating heroin overdoses. So San Francisco is a very progressive, absolutely fascinating city where all this stuff happens in a relatively small area. So you could be, now I can be talking about resuscitating heroin overdoses on 8th Street with a police officer who's the referee, and we can talk about it at halftime without feeling any, threat or remorse.
Wow. Amazing. And that you survived all this turmoil. And
yes. And I tell the young people that determine your principles, what they are, and do what you can to make them persist. And you can't compromise your principles, but I've always felt that I had to interact with the street world because that's where the dollars and the doctors and the medical supplies are, while still be committed to the counterculture value system. In other words, you can't, some people have been critical of that, but I believe if you believe in your value system, you have to do what is necessary, even without compromising your principles. So the key is to be very clear what your principles are. And what's very rewarding to me is we have all these medical students, a certain percentage of them, and these young physicians that are volunteering for a clinic or medical section is reopened and so morphed into Health Right 360, which is the large organization treating the frontline homeless. And they say they want to experience mission-driven healthcare because medicine in general has become very bureaucratic. So they want to find a place of mission-driven healthcare. So it has been very interesting to see how these messages have permeated, just like your wellness message. That was not popular when we were in medical school, but now
The word.
pardon me?
We had to spell wellness on the phone to people.
Right. Yeah, so I always look for progress. And that certainly is an area of progress. Prevention, wellness, health is not just the absence of disease. Treat people like human beings. I know, for example, we deliver frontline health care to the homeless. These courageous frontline clinic workers are out there treating the homeless, who are the highest risk population, and risking their own health. And I talked with one of the homeless that's out now in recovery, is doing well, because a certain number of them get out of that life and turn into useful citizens. And he said, the clinic treated me like a human being. Prior to that, I was just treated like an object to be ignored. And they treated me like a human being. And then I was more open to hearing their messages of health and recovery. So.
Mm-hmm. So I imagine that this wasn't a very lucrative career for you. And you probably went through a lot of self-sacrifice just to get things going. But
I did, but one of what happened with me is when my parents died, I inherited some money and I bought a apartment building on Frederick Street across from Alkezar. And I didn't have family and I didn't have children. And so I had some base of financial independence. Mm-hmm. It's a lot harder to be idealistic when you don't know where the food is coming from. It's a lot harder to be idealistic when you're got mountains of student debt. In other words, I didn't have student debt. I worked during medical school, as many of us did. But I had a base of income. If I looked at it now, I'm a parent of 4 and a grandfather of 5. I would no more in a million years do what I did then than I would now. In other words, when I started the clinic, they canceled my malpractice insurance. I risked all my financial health. Some professors at UCSF said, "Where did you go wrong? You were such a promising young medical student. They'd wonder why I went off the rails." So one of the reasons I supported some of Bernie Sanders' messages is the student debt that these students have when they come out squashes idealism.
Yeah.
And I just reflect back on that life. I sacrificed all my financial well-being. Didn't happen, but I was able to maintain it, but I risked it. Mm-hmm. But if I had mountains of student debt, would that have been the same burden as having children now? Right now, my focus financially is to help support my grandchildren, my kids, my family. I applaud these young people, but I would not do now what I did then. But I'd like to see what we can do, because I'm sure there's a very large number of young people in the healthcare field, as demonstrated by what they're doing in this coronavirus epidemic, that are idealistic, want to deal with outsider message, fringe populations, believe that healthcare is a right, not a privilege, but they're saddled by student debt. And it's a different time now. Certain things have made a lot of progress. Other things have gone backward. I When I look at the education I got a good education in California, but virtually cost-free. I worked, but I worked so I'd have money to date and drink beer and all this stuff. I didn't have to. I didn't have to work to pay tuition. Well, now these young people have to, have a couple, 3 jobs to pay off their student debt while they're studying their butts off in a very competitive thing. And if they're fortunate enough to have parents, their parents go into debt to support them. So it is it's a half-filled glass. And I hopefully this coronavirus epidemic to see what we need to keep society moving ahead will support this future generation.
Yeah. So the evolution of the free clinic in terms of management and I gather you retired from that, and how did it evolve? Who stepped in after you, and how's it managed now?
Well, first of all, it's interesting. The free clinic movement. There was a National Free Clinic Association meeting, and I was introduced as the father of the National Free Clinic movement, which is really nice. But it also gave me a view of what the free clinic movement is like now. There's something like 9,000 free clinics in the country, all over the place. Their philosophy is the same. Is non-judgmental healthcare to outsider populations, whether it be homeless, African Americans that are poor, farm workers, all sorts of things. But they don't really identify with the 60s countercultural movement other than history. For example, many of the new ones are church-based. Many of the new ones are by retired physicians. See their need in their community and basically do the same thing I did with the same idealistic strain, but for different reasons. So the free clinic movement has morphed into a much broader movement and is, I would say, managed more like a doctor would manage his doctor's office, or a health department would manage its a community clinic, or a church would manage a charity. Different, very different, but I don't care. I've learned over the years, I don't care why you do good things, just do good things. If you did it in a different way than I did, but it achieved the same goal, power, power to you. I love it. So it is morphed, and it's still being impacted on. I know I visited one where in the southern part of the United States where they were doing good things, but they were very uptight that they would get in conflict with the current administration. And, I gave them a pep talk and, stick to their principles, even if the current administrations, focus on employer mandated health insurance. Well, all their people were unemployed. They were homeless. But how's that going to work? So there's a huge political battle at the present time on the future of the country relative to what the appropriate healthcare system is. And I said, when you're running your free clinic, stay out of it. Just focus on doing what you can. Doesn't mean that you can't, in a separate situation, manifest your belief as I have here. I'm very vocal about what I think is wrong with the current administration's approach to healthcare, and who I support in terms of progressive healthcare policies. But I'm not going to make that part of, I'm not going to politicize the free clinic,
Mhm.
because then you will mobilize opposition. It's very interesting that we have conservatives, Republicans that send money to our clinic.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because they like what we're doing for young people and their drug problem. So,
Is it still on Clayton Street or what's?
yeah, the original site is a historic site at 558 Clayton Street. Healthcare, HR 360 has a very large facility over in a mission where the homeless are. And it's a combination of the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic and Walden House. Walden House was a therapeutic community, and up here on Buena Vista, just up the street from where I live. And they now have, they're the front lines of the homeless. So you have about 1,500 beds in the city and 500 outside the city. And the person that put it all together is Vitka Eisen. And she was a heroin addict that we detoxed at the Haight-Ashbury Clinic, went to Walden House, went to Harvard and got a doctorate, and then pulled the whole thing together. So she has a soft spot in her heart for the original site at 558 Clayton Street. So it's amazing to see what recovering addicts that have the skills can do.
Yeah. So it's a historic site, meaning it's a museum or?
Well, it still provides service, but we give tours. There's photos all over the wall. The medical students come there. The San Francisco Heritage Society wants to landmark the wall from '67 where they had one of our staff people on the influence of LSD painted this psychedelic collage before psychedelic collages were so popular. And so it is a historic site that we give tours, and it also provides service.
Interesting. So when did you let go of the reins and manage?
I moved from leadership to supporter, I think, when I entered my 70s, maybe 9 years ago. It was always a battle, and it's a battle that younger people are better suited to take. And really, Vitka Eisen, there was also some bad stuff that happened. That clinic was embezzled, almost went bankrupt. And then Vitka Eisen came on and saved it and merged it. And so I was very happy to see these things happen. It was a unfortunate period at which, that was when we were getting a lot of federal grants, and they said, well, you old hippies don't know how to manage this. So we brought in this slick new accountant that pulled the books together, and he also embezzled $600,000.
Wow.
He ended up doing in San Quentin. But another thing is, for a clinic to survive, you need good administration. And if you're going to stay in it the long term, and we doctors, we're ripe for being embezzled.
Yeah.
And I also found out that nobody wanted to embezzle us when we didn't have any money. But as soon as you get money, there's going to be bad people that want to come in and rip you off. And you need to have that. You need to have somebody watching your back. And I was never that good at watching my back. I mean, we had nothing to do with hiring him. But the embezzlement caught us by surprise and was disastrous. And it's interesting, the guy that caught the embezzlement was not the board, which had a lot of prominent business people on it, was Bob's student. We call him Barf Bucket Bob because he cleaned barf buckets at Grateful Dead concerts, and he got busted for selling LSD and went to jail and became a computer whiz. He's my IT guy. He brought the internet to the clinic back when I didn't even know what that was, and built the first website.
Mhm.
And he is the one that caught the fraud. You know, what had happened is that the slick accountant had used his computer system to set up a separate account and diverted the money that way. Well, the board missed it, but Bob caught it. And so old hippies have great value, and that's what set the whole thing under run. They found this alternate account. They found out they're putting government money in it. He wasn't buying anything. He just had a whole series of fake invoices. So in one sense, the old hippies saved the clinic, but the damage done by this embezzlement almost destroyed it. And it wasn't until Vicka Eisen and the Affordable Care Act, you know, the Affordable Care Act, you had to have a medical wing. So Walden House wanted to qualify under the Affordable Care Act, and that's why they merged with the clinic. It was, in a certain sense, our clinic was near bankrupt, but we had a medical license that allowed them to qualify. So it was a combination of Vicka Eisen and the Affordable Care Act, which of course we can go down the other lane where the current administration wants to eliminate the Affordable Care Act, which is just insane. There's an Affordable Care Act that helps save our clinic and help provide coverage to large numbers of people. And eliminating the Affordable Care Act will mean there will be large numbers of people, including a large number of addicts that need health care. It will increase the drug problem. It will increase the medical consequences of what we're going through now. And yet it'll be on the ballot in November. People will have, in fact, it's in the Supreme Court right now. You know, the current administration wants to rule the Affordable Care Act as unconstitutional. But it was interesting when I was giving a lecture to some free clinics in the South, and I kind of went on a rant about how important the Affordable Care Act and how important it was, and gave us a little history and my evaluations. A significant portion of the audience liked it, but a minority hated it, and I kind of dissed the entire lecture. So that's where I got a feel of, you know, you got to be very careful to talk about anything in this current very toxic political environment when you're ahead of something. But my assumption is talking to you on a Zoom is not going to run any. Anyway, I'm too old to be at risk for anything anyway.
Well, and so you're still practicing.
Yeah, I do a lot by Zoom with patients, conference meetings. I serve as medical director of a couple of addiction programs at Marin County, one called Ward for adolescent substance abusers. I've, you know, we dealt with a lot of acute adverse reactions, such as adverse reactions to marijuana in the 60s. I did not really become aware of the brain dysfunction that early onset use of potent forms of marijuana can cause these young people. So it's a constant learning experience. And I've started dealing with the long-term effects of these drugs. And I'm privileged to be around, excellent young psychiatrists, Nick Reeves, and good medical staff, Lisa Sewell, a nurse, and the Muirwood was started by a visionary Scott Sewell. So I'm through Zoom and through limited participation in staff meetings and patient consultation, and since the transformative movement, now addiction medicine is a board certified specialty, and I'm past president of the American Society of Addiction Medicine, and all the new research comes out over the internet. And I transmit to the staff both there and Avery Lane, which is for women, Health Right 360, which is a public large therapeutic community, and Centerpoint. Those are my 4 focuses, and I use this information now for the medical students and the residents. So it's a different world, and I'm a slow adapter, but they now call me Dr. Zoom because I participate in all these things.
What was the first organization? I couldn't catch the name.
It's called Muirwood, specializes in treatment of adolescents, particularly with cannabis dependence problems. Second was Avery Lane for women with alcohol problems. The third is Health Right 360, and the fourth is Centerpoint.
And they're all local in the Bay Area?
Health Right 360 is San Francisco, Centerpoint, Muirwood, and Avery Lane are in Marin County.
Uh-huh. And I've lived in and out of Marin County for 40 years and didn't know about them, so.
Yeah, the recovery movement has really hit Marin County. Here in San Francisco, the focus tends to be more on harm reduction. So if you want to experience recovery from addiction, Marin County tends to be more the dominant force. And I'm in recovery myself. I'm an avid participant in AA, and so I like to be around recovery, not just the negative consequences, the overdoses. And I think that's what has inspired me to become more aware of the wellness movement, mindfulness, because those are all, parts of the recovery. You, of course, know this better than I do, but I begin my day each day with a prayer from AA. It says, "For today, do not be unafraid. Do not be afraid for today." Actually, I'll read it for you. "Just for today, I will be unafraid. Especially, I will not be afraid to enjoy what is beautiful and to believe what I give to the world as the world will give to me." Well, those prayers come from AA, but if you put it into a broader picture, that's what mindfulness and spirituality and wellness is about.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure those are the types of things that you teach. In other words, you don't have to be in AA to believe that. It is the nature of the prayer and the rhythm that helps. UCSF has this thing where they use music for autistic people. They put brain scans on them. And it turns out that it is not so much the content of the music, but the rhythm of the music that activates the right brain. So you have to buy into the content in order to participate in it. I happen to buy into this content, but it's the rhythm of dealing with emotion and going outside of your zone, however you do it. It's the doing it that's important. I believe that prayer is very therapeutic and healing.
Wow. What a journey.
Yes.
And it's not over yet.
Right. Yeah. What a journey to bring me in front of the Zoom, talking to a distinguished doctor like you, reading AA prayers over Zoom.
Well, I'm delighted to get to know you better. And the brief contact we had, I don't even know how you found out I was in Marin, because I barely landed, I think.
Well, it was we had this forum for community education. We actually had quite a few different types of people. And so it was a different time. Now it would be easy to find you. You got Zoom and literature and this, that, and the other thing. But that was the beginnings of the counterculture movement. About that time, we started having acupuncture, way before acupuncture was popular.
Mm-hmm.
And you start tracing how they found out about it. Well, Craig Whitehead knew this Chinese doctor that used acupuncture for Chinese heroin addicts, and he brought him in, and he gave talks on acupuncture that same place you did. So it'd be easy to find you now. Then it was the counterculture communication system that of this, all these things, wellness, acupuncture, spirituality, that we believe was part of the broader field of the practice of medicine.
Well, I'm just delighted that I tracked you down and we've had this time together. And if you have any parting words for the future generations, we hope will make use of this historical episode.
I'm very happy to participate, and very nice visiting with you at this stage in your life. And I hope that our conversation will help inspire future generations. So
exactly.
And you keep up the good work. It's very nice talking to you.
Thank you, David. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.